during these periods of depression. He has never felt remotely homicidal. Second, whenever he felt things were not going right, he would abandon his usual program of exercise and good nutrition and start gorging himself on junk food like Twinkies and Coca-Cola. Mr. White has always been an athlete, being physically fit, but when something would go wrong, he'd get high on the sugar stuff. The more junk food he ate, the worse he felt, and it was just a vicious cycle. The characteristic of Mr. White is also that he never sought treatment for these episodes.
All right. So then, Doctor, with that background, can you tell us a little about some of the psychiatric history that took place with regard to these tragic events on November 27th, 1978?
Yes, I can. The fall of 1978 saw the combination of several intense pressures being brought to bear upon Mr. White. First, in the summer, he decided to run for political office. And then he had the joy of this victory taken away from him when he was told that he had to give up his job as a fireman because of a potential conflict of interest. This got him twice because first the other supervisors had conflict of interest, but they merely had to abstain from voting, whereas Mr. White had to give up his job. And second, he took a severe pay cut. Supervisors get paid $10,000 a year, and he was already in heavy debt due to his campaigning efforts. Adding to the financial pressures was the necessity of having to find another business. So Mr. White opened a fast food restaurant, which he had to take out a second mortgage on his house and borrow $20,000. Another source of continuing pressure on Mr. White, which is somewhat subtle, is the fact that he got married and was so indifferent about being married. Though he feels he has an excellent marriage, even his wife has never really shared in his feelings. When he's feeling really crummy, he just leaves her alone and sleeps on the couch. However, his most profound and proximate cause of stress is his attending position to the San Francisco city office.
All right, so Doctor, all these stressful factors which you've just described, how does that fit in with the mental status in the examination that you conducted with Mr. White?
All right, I say these are the kinds of stresses that were impinging on Mr. Wright at the time of his homicide. He was also being portrayed in the press as an anti-gay and anti-black, accusations which he gave me lots of data on, and I would suggest they're simply unfounded. In addition to attacks by the press, there was also literal attacks on or literal threats of attacks on the supervisors by people holding grudges. He told me that a number of supervisors like himself carried guns to scheduled meetings. Also, the lack of activity and all his junk food caused him to gain 20 pounds while he was served on the board. When he resigned, he immediately felt a sense of relief, but almost immediately thereafter felt very guilty and depressed that he had let his supporters down. So on November 14th, he saw the mayor again, told him that he had changed his mind and that he wanted his resignation letter back. The mayor said he would and that he would reappoint him. But apparently the mayor changed his mind, and through the press, he said the only one who supports Dan White for reappointment is Dan White. As you can assume, this was very upsetting to Dan White. He turned to junk food again for comfort. Soon, Mr. White was just sitting in front of the TV. He used to read, but he would just watch TV. He was very depressed that he wasn't being reappointed. He was just watching TV and binging on Twinkies. He couldn't sleep. Virtually no sexual contact with his wife. He was dazed, confused, had crying spells, became increasingly ill, and just wanted to be left alone.
All right, well, doctor, given these stress factors that you've outlined, what would you then conclude from this data as to the events, as to why these events took place?
Well, as you know, he decided to go to City Hall. He got up, he shaved, put a suit on. You just saw his gun laying on the table and ammunition. He just put them in his pocket. Then he went to see the mayor, and the mayor almost directly tells him, "I'm not going to reappoint you." Dan responded by, he was really stunned. Revolving around in his head was the thought, "I'm not going to get my job back. People had counted on me. What am I going to do?" He tried to get the mayor to share with him the basis for his not reappointing him, but he never gave him a reason why. The mayor just kept repeating that he wasn't going to reappoint him. Finally, Dan fell silent. He was deflated, limp, and lethargic. He kind of sat in his chair and just sunk in. He tells me that, "I felt my face get kind of flushed, my head was pounding, and my face was hot." The mayor asked him, "What about your family? Can your wife get your job back? What's going to happen to your family now?" Somehow this inquiry directed at his family struck a nerve, and Mr. White felt totally helpless and directionless. The mayor's voice started to fade out, and Mr. White felt as if he was in a dream. And like a reflex, he drew the revolver. He had no idea how many shots he fired, and the similar event occurred a few moments later in Supervisor Melk's office. He tells me that he was aware that he engaged in a lethal act, but he tells me he gave no thought to his wrongfulness. As he put it to me, "I had no chance to even think about it."
All right, well, Doctor, you mentioned this thing about the ingestion of sugars and sweets and Twinkies and whatnot. So I'd like to just touch on that briefly with the jury over here. Does that have any significance, or could it possibly have any significance at all?
Well, I think so, Mr. Smith. First, there's a substantial body of evidence that in susceptible individuals, large quantities of what we call junk food, high sugar content food, with lots of preservatives can cause antisocial and even violent behavior. There have been some studies, for example, that where they have taken so-called career criminals and changed their junk food diet to meat, potatoes, and milk, that their criminal records immediately evaporated. I also think that all the pressures impinging on Mr. White for months made it very difficult for him to think very much about what he was doing. I think he was operating largely in an unthinking, emotional way. I think he was physically exhausted. And I would suspect that if it were not for these tremendous pressures, and for not for the ingestion of the aggravating factor of all the junk foods, that these homicides would not have taken place.
I suspect no pun there when you say meat, potatoes, and milk there, do we? Anyhow, do you feel that on November 27th he had the capacity for premeditation and deliberation?
Well, I can't give you a definite yes or no to that question, but I feel that these pressures sufficiently confused him, and he didn't have his wits about him. I think that these factors would play a substantial part in impairing his ability to premeditate.
All right, so can you give an opinion on that, whether or not he had the capacity to harbor malice or malice aforethought in that state of mind?
Yes, I can. His capacity to harbor malice would be significantly affected by the powerful pressures that I just explained.
All right then, Doctor. So, more so with your expertise, was that type of provocation the type of provocation that would arouse some passion in a person? Not necessarily in the ordinarily reasonable person, but just that so he would kill, but simply arouse that person?
Yes, I think that any man, even one for whom reappointment did not hold such a very special significance like it did in Mr. White, would be aroused by tremendous emotions and tremendous passion, which might serve to short-circuit some of the mental processes necessary for premeditation, malice, intent, and so on.
All right, so then kind of coming to a close here, Doctor, what is your diagnosis then of the defendant?
My diagnosis is that Dan White is suffering from depression and intense pressure, and that pressure circumvented the mental processes necessary for premeditation, malice, and intent.